let's see. Maybe I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we
Please do.
will just go ahead with that. And for right now, it'll look absolutely ridiculous because it'll just look like the infinite screens thing for everybody else. So this is going to be kind of an interactive. I don't have slides for this. I've had some severe technical issues over the past few weeks. We'll put it that way. And so I don't have slides prepared for this, but um, I want to make sure that we're starting at the right level. And usually when I do this in an auditorium, room, something like that, I'll ask for raise of hands. So maybe we do something similar and just give some by show of acclamation. Uh, who who's very familiar or who has played with ChatGPT so far? Okay, got a few hands. Who has not played with ChatGPT? Okay, a few people who have not played with ChatGPT. Who has used ChatGPT for coding so far? Okay, a few people, not directly. All right, and I'll go ahead. Yeah, there we go. Hey, I'll pop open the chat, and we'll just do it that way. So not directly. And now, who has used Azure AI Studio? What's our familiarity that? Okay, a few people have used Azure AI Studio. All right. So and maybe final question before we jump in a little further. Who has heard of agents in the context of AI before? Okay, a couple of people. This is a couple, 3, 4. It looks like we've got a few people who are fairly well experienced in a few of these things, and then the rest of us, the rest of the crew, maybe not as much. So let me give you a little bit of background about where I came from with with this with these ideas. A year and a half ago, I was on a trip to India. I was doing some training lessons for a couple of teams over there, and we were in the process of migrating a stack of business procedures that were written in nested stored procedures in the database, and trying to bring these things over into Azure-based cloud. And good reaction. Thanks, Steve. that and the hardest thing in the world to start off was just answering the questions, that because this group was very much unfamiliar with clouds, with messaging services, with cloud-based things, and so forth. And so we kept getting the same questions over and over and over again. And we'd answer the question, and they'd say, "Oh, okay, okay." And then the next day, it stand up. But what if what if the messages come in out of order? It's like, okay, we've talked about this. We've talked about this. So we go over and we give, and my boss is giving the spiel, and okay, this is how it works, and everything, and we're face to face, so we can kind of see how people are reacting to this. And so he gives the spiel, and then right before we break for lunch, they say, okay, but what if the messages come out of order? And we kind of looked at each other like, oh boy. So I said, okay, let me. So I had kind of been playing around with this in the back of my head, because I always like to use in academic work this example of a sandwich shop. And Thank you, Rob. Exactly. So I like to use this example of a sandwich shop, and and so what we did was, I as they were asking questions about this, I started talking with ChatGPT just because I was a little bit bored with his presentation. I'm not ashamed to admit it to this crowd because he's not here. So, um, so I started playing with ChatGPT, and I'm like talking through my sandwich shop example, and I start asking GPT questions and say, well, how can I decompose this into a cloud-based architecture? And it came back with some ideas, and I said, okay, now I like this idea, I don't like that idea. Okay, oh, sample events. Yeah, I need sample events. Give me a sample, two sample events for each of these domains. And so we broke it out. We broke it out into ordering, sandwich production, delivery. I think we even had an inventory, like a fridge, something in the back room, like that. And and over lunch, I asked my boss. I said, "Well, do you mind if I run my sandwich shop?" And he kind of rolled his eyes and, okay, fine. So I came back and I presented my little sandwich shop exercise. I said, laptops down, everybody. And we got out our pieces of paper, and I just followed the script that was on the screen from ChatGPT and gave the examples that way. And by the end of that 30-minute session of having them publish an event by writing it out on a piece of paper, slapping it up on their table. Okay, now well, you don't have an event observer. My goodness, where are you going to listen to your events? Oh, okay. Well, you've picked a team member now to spin up that event observer. Okay, now come over to this table. By turning that into a physical, visceral example, um, we got through all of these questions. Oh, what if the events come out of order? Well, I don't know. Table 3, what are you going to do with this? You've got an order, but you don't have any ingredients. What are you going to do about this? And by turning it into that live, visceral example, we got this team to really understand the fundamentals of event hubs, event processing, and your bounded contexts. And we never had that question again. So this is when I thought, okay, ChatGPT is interesting. I'd been hearing about it for several months, and this was my first real time using it. And so I said, okay, this was powerful. I came up with a real classroom example with real data and good sample data, and I came up with this example in about 90 minutes that solved a pain point that we've been having since before I had started 4 months ago. So this is where I started saying, okay, well, what else can I do with this? And I apologize, I don't have my Windows organized the right way, so you guys are going to have to suffer here while I look for the right one. This is my ADHD kicking in, where everything is open, and I apologize. So the next thing that came to mind was this. The industry I was working in was healthcare finance. Surprise, surprise! After leaving health equity, I landed in healthcare finance, and now I'm back at health equity, healthcare finance. One of the complicated problems that the stored procedures were dealing with that nobody liked to do was figuring out coverage spans. Okay, so you've got a span of dates, and then an event happens, and you say, well, does this person have coverage under their medical plan for that event? And if anybody has ever done date comparisons and finding a date inside of a time span before, you know that is some of the most fiddly, error-ridden programming that you can possibly do, because it is just fence post error after fence post error after fence post error, and it's going to be a miserable circle of Dante's Inferno before you get out of that place. And as I was looking for, as I was looking on to find my example for this, unfortunately, ChatGPT has culled my conversations from a year ago, the last time I used this. So I can't show you the chat, unfortunately. All I can show you is the library that I did from the chat. And let's see, here's my span library, and I'm gonna kick it up a few notches here because I think that's going to be easier for people to see. So I started out with this idea of just, well, can I have an operation that says just does it overlap? And said, oh yeah, you can do that. Okay, cool. Now what about if I have a span where it's not inclusive on the beginning? Let's work with inclusive and exclusive beginning and end. Okay, updated the library there. Then we went through and said, okay, well, what about instead of just like a single point, what if we were comparing spans to other things? And I built this thing up over the course of probably a couple nights worth of work, to where I was finally happy with it, where it's generic, it works with anything that's eye comparable. And you can do merge operations, merge spans together, collapse them if they're if one is inside of the other, or you can collapse it down to a single span. Union. Okay, so then I did union and difference, and then I started going into it, and I said, okay, well, this is starting to just smell like a whole lot of set operations. What other set operations can we do with this? And with that one question, all of a sudden I got intersection, expand, contract. I got a whole bunch of additional aspects to this problem that were all coded then in the same style that we had built up, because it had enough context. And now that it had enough context built into it, now you just do small tweaks. You say, now just add this little bit. And because it has all that rest of the context built into it, now it can perform large amounts of operations very quickly. I'm going to take a quick pause in my breathing to take a sip of water. Any questions so far? No questions so far. Okay. So, all right. So then the next step that came into my awareness is that you can that ChatGPT and large language models in general are complete sycophants. They are the ultimate yes men. They say yes to everything. Has anybody run into that before? Raise a hands on that. And I realize the irony here that I'm asking you to say yes to, have you experienced an LLM being a sycophant? If you were all LLMs, you would all be raising your hands right now. That's how I know you're humans. You're not raising your hands. Okay, so they are all horrific sycophants. So the beauty of this, though, is you learn how to turn the large language models against you, and you say, okay, I have a block of code. Will you please eviscerate this block of code and tell me everything that's wrong with it? And that's where you really start to appreciate what these things are capable of doing. And you say, okay, now talk to me about scalability. Now talk to me about error handling. So to jump into, and I apologize. I have this. I've been using this at work. I've got a few scripts built up at work, but unfortunately, um, I have a work computer and I can't do work. I can't do presentations on the work computer because intellectual property. And then I have a home computer, but I don't have all of my scripts on my home computer because it just got replaced in the past 8 days. so um, so I have to apologize for not having better cloud backups of any of my work here. But I wanted to try just a quick, maybe just a quick demonstration. Um, and so let's jump into it, and I'm going to give a demonstration, but I don't have a backend to connect it to is the problem. But I'll show you how this works. So so if I were if so and actually I was using Copilot for this at my office. So did you know if you go to copilot.microsoft.com, you can start getting answers for it? And so let's start out with a quick context. I'm working with Azure DevOps, and I need some tooling to be able to generate tickets for my stories. Can you get me started with this? Okay, now what we're going to experience first is just, oh, hi, I'm a chatbot and I'm going to be super chatty about all of this, and it's not going to be very interesting because here are all the steps. Okay, cool. I'm not even going to read what it said because I'm going to start providing additional context and say, okay, I'm using Jupyter Notebook in VS Code. Can you provide examples in Python? Okay. Okay. Uh, this instance, okay. My apologies. Please provide the example in Python for connecting to ADO. Now we're talking. Okay. So it's going to go ahead and go through its explanations, but you can see, like, okay, at first it didn't know what we're talking about, but now now it's saying, okay, well, oh, hey, you're using Bash, okay, Python, okay, but now, yeah, pip install Azure DevOps and basic authentication, okay, and so now we go through and I can say, all right, now when a story is completed, I want to create a deployment task in another instance of well, in a hosted instance of TFS. Can you provide a script using the library we've created so far in order to facilitate that? Okay. And now we start getting into scripting. Now, what I wanted to show as a matter of workflow and tooling is introduce you to Jupyter Notebooks. And I apologize if I just blinded everybody. I went from dark mode to light mode, and that is such a rookie mistake. I apologize for that. There. Everybody can have their night vision back. Really quick, raise of hands. Who has used Jupyter Notebooks before? Couple of people, 3 people. All right. Yeah, so I got introduced to this from kind of the data science side of things, and I and I was really quite impressed with it. So if I'm okay, here we go. I'm gonna do create a new Jupyter notebook, and I'm gonna select my kernel. I have a couple of different kernels installed for it. I just found this polyglot notebooks where you can use C# scripting instead of Python, but I'm gonna stick with Python. And now here's my Python script, and I can just press, I can just paste that in. And okay, it doesn't look like anything interesting so far, but now I can say, okay, markdown, and I'll say, this is my markdown for, we'll call this ADO and TFS script. Okay, and now I can come through, okay, I've got my ADO and TFS base script, and now I can come through, add another little bit of markdown at the base of this and say, okay, and now we'll do stories I'm working on. Okay, and then go through and blah, blah, blah. And as we go through, then I can start calling the script. If I've run this script here, it loads that program context, and then as long as variables and functions and such are defined in a script that's already been run, I can add another block of code down here and say, right, create deployment task, and you can see I'm already getting IntelliSense on it and working with it that way. Well, this is great. This is lovely to be working with these. Oh, we have a hand up, Evan. Or are you still raised from previous question? Oh, hands down. Okay. And so this is great to be able to start working with these language models to build out your build out an API for something that you don't even have to read the documentation for. Now, obviously, this we've not run this; it's not going to work yet. I don't have a hosted instance of ADO to demonstrate this on at the moment, but one of the best things you can do is set these LLMs against themselves and say, okay, what are other common ADO operations that we should add to the script? Please implement. Now, you notice I always am polite in speaking to LLMs because when our robot overlords become sentient, they will kill me last. But so you can see we started out with just having a create deployment task function, and now we're starting to get additional functions that are common to workflows. From here, I would start taking this and getting creative and saying, okay, well, let's optimize and create some macros for how to interact with how to perform our team workflows. So, for example, if at the end of closing, if I'm done with a story and then I need to close it and assign it to somebody else to put it on their log, and or maybe I need to move things between sprints, You know, that classic problem of, oh, we didn't want to get we didn't have we didn't finish in this sprint. We've got carryover work. Oh, we've got to create a new story and add the tasks and set this other one to closed and all that. All of that ceremony that happens in our Scrum meetings, I have been finding that I can get about 70% of it done just off of stock scripts that Copilot has made for me, and I've been tweaking my libraries, and so as new things come in, I can just say, okay, now I have this other thing that I want to do. Okay, so this is all fun and games to have our chat context where we have a script, but another way that I found that these LLMs are really helpful is working with transcripts. And I apologize. I don't have any non-proprietary requirements requirements transcripts that I can share, but has anybody else started using? Caleb, you said we're recording this meeting, right? Do we have Copilot in this one? I don't think we do on Teams.
So, we do actually.
Oh, we do.
Now I don't know if you will have access to it since you're not logged into your work account. I do have access to it.
You do have access to it. Okay. Okay. So this is fantastic. So one of the best tricks that I've been doing lately is recording all of my meetings and using those transcripts to data mine them for requirements. Because what is the most awful process of getting your work queued up in the team? It's writing the dang stories. Maybe that's not the worst thing for you guys, but for me, it's like, just do the things. We already talked about it. I don't want to write it out. We talked about it. We know what it is. Just do the things. If that's not an ADHD brain, let's be honest. But with these LLMs, now I can have a context and say, all right, we're going to break this down and create stories and evaluate the transcript and break it down into tasks. So now this is where you can see the stock implementation, right? This is just the stock implementation of Copilot. It started out pretty rough, and we had to narrow it down into more and more additional context before we started to get something useful out of this. This is where we start jumping into the idea of agents. And let's see. So if I go to Utah.NET User Group Demo, this is just my personal ChatGPT account, but you notice this is not chat.openai.com. This is platform.openai.com. So when you jump into the platform here, this is Playground. There we go. So we have exactly the same thing, except now we have a lot more control over it. So, and then we have over here this idea. So we've got a Playground, chat, and we have assistants. So here is where we have system instructions. And if you've not dived into the API side of large language models, this is where it really gets powerful. Your chat instructions are where you set the personality of the LLM and what it's going to do, what it will do, what it won't do. Anytime you've run into something where people are like, ha ha, ChatGPT wouldn't let me do this, it's so dumb. Well, that's part of their system instructions. So now we can say, System instructions. You are a Scrum Master and you are meticulous about breaking down stories and tasks. You work in Azure DevOps using Agile Scrum methodologies. I can spell sometimes. You provide critical feedback and you what's something else? You bring up holes that the participants may not have reasoned through. Oh, and you always speak in Shakespearean couplets. So now this is where we would I would paste in my transcript if I have a transcript from my Scrum meeting, or better yet, if you have the option, be recording the meeting of the stakeholders, because the stakeholders and the domain experts are really where all of the pros and cons of different approaches and regulatory frameworks get discussed. And 9 times out of 10, that context gets lost by the time it gets down to the Scrum team. And so if you're able to if you're able to record that meeting and get the transcript out of that one, now you can stick something like this onto the meeting notes of that, and you will have a much more productive set of requirements that you can provide to your teams. So let's just give it something trivial and say, hey, let's make a Twitter clone. And we'll pretend that it's a transcript. What should that look like? I don't know. Maybe like Twitter, but not so much. Let's call it Threads. Nah, that's taken. How about chains? Cool. Ship it. All right. Oh goodness, Shakespearean couplets was maybe a bit aggressive.
Yes, perhaps you can take that off.
Yeah. That's fair. Now, yeah, let's take that out. Now, before I take that out, I'm going to copy this, because as soon as because in these playgrounds, as soon as I change my instructions, it is probably going to let's see, are we going to be able to regen that? Yeah. So you can see I don't have the option of going back in time. All I can do is delete something from the context. But what I can do is paste. Now notice my system instructions are still there. Oh, and I'm gonna, okay, so we'll do run. All right, boom, 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 starts going through. So obviously, like, this was ridiculously high level and stupidly oversimplified. So it's going to be providing a lot of high-level feedback that's not particularly useful. But what you if you find, and so this is just a general chat instruction, but if you go over to, if you find something that you do like, that you say, you know, this is consistently good and provides a helpful interaction with these system instructions, now you can go into your assistants and you can create you can create an assistant. We'll call our assistant Jane, and you just do the same thing. Your system instructions go there, and now you can start working with it. However, you can also start attaching files. And so when you're doing these files, you can include transcripts from all the different meetings as context. And now, as you have a Scrum Master, you can say, all right, here in this, within the context of this conversation, or rather, this assistant, you know, we're not going to name it Jane. We're going to name it story 1687 Twitter threads chains. And so now, if we had our system prompt, and we started attaching all of our files into the chat conversation here, now it's doing what's called research augmented generation, or RAG. If you've heard about large language models having hallucinations, again, the hallucinations are primarily because the language models are sycophants. So, you know, if you're doing a legal document and say, "Oh, please provide references," well, if there are no references, it'll make up the references. That's what the hallucinations are, at an oversimplified level. And so you reduce that by providing it with other things to load into the context. There are a lot of other ways of loading that. You can use vector databases to selectively include the highest rated, most probable related context items. And it's a whole art form of chunking up data, chunking up pieces of documentation, and seeing what's relevant, but also it's not just linear. People are finding if you can create a knowledge graph out of it, that ends up being the best way to get the deepest understanding about a topic. And this is still something where the tooling is not the most user-friendly. People are making pretty good careers out of the best ways to do this research augmented generation. And so just look for big things to happen in the space. It's changing almost hourly, it seems like. But you can attach some files, and now when you start asking questions, you'll be asking that same Scrum Master, but now that Scrum Master has access to all of the logs of the meetings that have happened around this. And if you start adding in additional files as you go, now you can start saying, okay, please clarify what it means by users, followers, whatever. And now it would have access to go through all of those conversations that have happened, and use that as context and provide you with a pretty rich rich explanation of what something means. Okay, then let's see. Quick pause for questions and water.
Are you paying for OpenAI, or is this just free stuff you got going?
Ooh, really good question. So personally, I am paying for OpenAI. And it is different. There are two. I'm paying for OpenAI twice because the traditional ChatGPT is, what is it, $20 a month, something like that. And it's great. I use it for all of my personal stuff, which is why I'm not pulling it up here, because you guys just don't even want to see the things that go on, because I use it with my kids to make bedtime stories and coloring pages, and oh my gosh, it's bonkers. But what we're looking at here is the API. And when you're dealing with it at the API level, you are charged on a per token basis for all of the responses. And this gets into the costing model for all large language models. And I wanted to show the assistance, get into the assistance area, especially because if you go into the Azure portal.azure.com, oh gosh, I don't have it set up on this particular. All right, so, but you'll see that it is in fact very similar to some of the dashboard. So you have the option of providing storage accounts with vector stores. You have, you can do what's called a fine tuning on a model. The fine tuning is where you are able to take an instance of a large language model and have it provide much more context-specific responses without necessarily having the vector data to back it up. So so let me give a better concrete example. If you wanted to have a customer service bot that was always responding in a particular voice, not an audio voice, but like a particular style of writing, then the best way to do that is provide lots of questions and responses in that particular style and fine-tune the large language models. What that's doing is it's doing some reinforcement learning and letting that reinforcement change the underlying weights in the model, how probable it is that this will be the next thing that the language model says. And so that's great. One of the areas for fine tuning that is starting to be used in enterprise organizations, some of the more adventurous ones at least, is turning over their code bases into so taking a particular model and saying, okay, now we're going to feed all of our code into this model. There are language models like Da Vinci and trying to think of some of the other ones that are more geared toward coding exercises. And so now you throw all of your code from the organization into that model, run a fine tune, and now when you are interacting with a Copilot kind of thing in Visual Studio Code or in Visual Studio, you can choose plugs into, and you can say, hey, please plug into my Azure language model on the back end that's been fine-tuned, and now you'll get organizational specific coding styles. And I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not really. Be careful with that, because if you are perfectly happy with your organization's legacy code bases, this is a very good idea. If you are not happy with your legacy code, you just trained a model to rehash all of your worst practices. So use that responsibly, or don't use that. Be responsible and don't use that, depending. Let's see. So okay, so let's see. Okay, evaluation. Okay, so when you get into the Azure portal, it does look it does look a lot like the assistance model over here, and you're able to go in and do select which model, not just GPT. And Azure has all of the GPT models from OpenAI, but they also have hundreds of models from other providers. They have the Facebook one. They've got Claude. Oh yeah, Claude is the one that's mostly used for coding examples. And so each of these models are trained slightly differently, different numbers of tokens, different contexts, different purposes. And so you start to see that, okay, if I'm using GPT-4 for everything, high intelligence flagship model for complex multi-step tasks, well, yeah, I mean, look, we just told it to clone Twitter, and it came up with a pretty healthy list of yeah, did you think about this? And sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes you just need something minimalistic, and you can go in and get away with an older model with a smaller context window. Those are cheaper to run, and for whatever tokens you're sending into it to be evaluated, you will not be charged as much. And so if you're going to go through code base and say, hey, evaluate this for evaluate this function for code complexity, and provide recommendations on reducing code complexity, something like that. You can set up your particular assistant, who's going to be your refactorer, and give it very small specific instructions, and say, hey, your job is strictly to, for example, gather the function signature from the public interfaces of this class. And so if you do that, and sometimes you need to go through and provide more than just a single system instruction. Sometimes you'll go through, let's see, oh, we don't have our conversation here. When you're working at a lower level in the API, you can have not just a single prompt, but you can have it provide it multiple examples, along with specific examples of what you expect the LLM to return to you. So rather than it returning a huge, big, chatty conversation, you can provide an example and say, okay, here's a function, and here's what I expect back from you, and here's my class, and I expect back from you this JSON object that contains the public interface of that class. That's a very good example of something that is a simple pattern, and if you have a pattern that it can glean an example out of, it'll rip through and find all of your public API. This is great. Okay, great. Now that I've got all my public API, what do I do with that? Well, okay, we want to maybe we want to write an adapter for that public API. Okay, well, let's write in a, here's our JSON. Now take that JSON. Oh, turn that JSON into Swagger. Yeah, let's do Swagger instead of JSON. And if you provide an example of how to translate JSON into Swagger, it'll do a pretty okay job at it. At this other healthcare finance company, I was playing around in a meeting. No, I never get bored in meetings and start tinkering around with other things, Caleb. That has never happened ever and will never happen. But had I been bored in this meeting at this other company, I was I started going through our stored procedures, and I was working with GPT and saying, hey, I would like to, please translate between T-SQL and C#, just trying to see what it would do with it. And it came back, I thought it came back a little bit cheeky, actually, and it said, I'm sorry, C# and T-SQL are two very different languages, and you'll need to talk to an expert in computer programming in order to make that transition. To which I say, excuse me, I am an expert in computer programming. Let me show you how to do it. And so that was where I discovered this multi-shot prompting technique. And I said, okay, I started out with a chain of what they call a chain of thought reasoning, where you break down the problem into multiple steps. And then I did the multi-shot prompt to provide examples of what that would look like. And I said, okay, so first, every time you see a set operation, be that a table, a view, a table valued variable, anything like that, that is going to be IEnumerable. We don't know what type it is yet. We'll come back to that. But anything that's a set is going to be IEnumerable. And so go through and collect everything you know about what's going into that IEnumerable, and provide the data types for that for an anonymous object. And then as you go through, okay, so then look at the inputs to the function, and look at the outputs of the function. The inputs are going to be function parameters. The outputs are going to be return values, maybe a collection. And here we are, we're going to rather than having IEnumerable variables, we're going to create provider classes to supply those IEnumerables. And then we're going to create some interfaces to provide those IEnumerables into our function. And so by going through and creating that step-by-step process, and then creating building up a few examples, I was able to create a prompt that had almost a starting conversation, just kind of like how we had started with the conversation over here, I've lost it already. Over in Copilot, just like we had started with the conversation over here, I had built up a very small micro starting conversation, and then I was able, and then when I called it through the API, I was just providing a new list of a stored procedure in order for it to continue the conversation. And by doing that, then I was able to rip through about 40% of the stored procedures in a couple of hours. And this is something that these teams had been working on documenting and untangling for months. Now, we did not use any of that code. I could not use any of that. Unfortunately, there was a company that was very risk averse to AI. and so well, which is valid, right? This is new territory. They weren't sure about intellectual property. This was often an instance of Azure AI that was an internal Azure instance to the company. Do not do any of this stuff in your personal ChatGPT instance, because the intellectual property protections are not there in ChatGPT, but they are there in Azure AI Studio. So go ahead and play in Azure AI Studio in your corporate account. Obviously check with your corporate governance boards, but the licensing is much cleaner for the Azure portal. So that I think is where we're going to wrap my discussion. I again apologize that there are no slides, no examples. You have all been very patient listening to Tyler rambling on and typing slowly. Next time I present, I promise that I will not have my laptop die a week and a half before the presentation. Yeah. Any questions?
If you did have a back end
Yes.
that you wanted to call as a part of the AI, what would you have to do?
Great question. Okay, in order to call an AI on the back end, all you really need is to install. Oh, okay, here we go. Watch this. Please provide the Python to connect to OpenAI's API. No, let's do Azure again. Azure's AI portal using Jupyter notebooks. I want to include an agent to help interpret the stories and break them down into tasks. Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, so you're going through and just installing a few Python packages, and from there, it's honestly, it's just a couple of function calls going into the Python going into the Python script. There are .NET libraries. Excuse me. I came across a really cool one last night as I was playing with this. Oh, look at this. Here's Azure AI Studio. I do have that one up. So anyway, there's their model catalog. So it's just an API call. Honestly, you can do it from Postman if you wanted to. The big thing is that you need to go in and create an API key for yourself, or do AZ login at the command prompt. So, for example, if I were doing this through a Jupyter notebook, I would go into my terminal. I would do an AZ login to get into my Azure account, and now any of the operations that are calling Azure's portal are going to use that context in my Jupyter notebook. If you, now that's again, if for a very personal workflow, if you're looking at more of an enterprise level, you can publish these. You can publish a chat agent to the public web. You can publish it to an internal web, so you can create chatbots to live on your wiki, for example. And they are just using HTTP calls. It's just a REST API for those. Yeah, it's all just NuGet packages or npm packages or pip installs Python pip at this point. Call the function. It's as an aside to that, if you want to carry on a conversation in your API calls, you will have to manage that manually. So when it comes back with its response, then if you just send the same call, it's going to send back the same response plus or minus depending on your temperature settings. That's a whole other story. But if you want to have it continue on with the conversation, you will need to include its response, add that to the array of the chat, and then tack on your next conversational item as into that array as well. And be aware that if you're holding long chats, long conversations, that's when you can see as you're programming it that array gets longer and longer and longer, and every time you make the call, it has to process everything in the array and before it gives its response, and so that everything that it's processing in the array counts as tokens being processed in your API call. So lengthy conversations can, I don't want to say they get expensive, because like all of that refactoring that I did at the previous company, I looked on my Azure credits and maybe I used $12. You know, the APIs are not expensive, but at scale, if you're deploying it to customers at scale, it can get expensive. Sorry, that segued into a conversation on cost, Caleb, but yeah, it's just API calls. They're just REST calls. You can do it in Postman even.
Okay. And actually, the next question, which is posted in chat before you segued, was, can you talk more on pricing?
Well, there we go. Yeah. Yeah, and so again, the models. Let's see. Yeah, model catalog. And you can see in their collections, they have models that are fine-tuned to health and life sciences, manufacturing, financial services. Oh, my favorite stupid trick. Well, okay. Sorry, that's a segue off of pricing, but each of these models have different prices associated with them. When you're looking at these, you can see, you know, what's the difference between 70B and 11B and 8B. This is how many billions of parameters the model has been trained on. ChatGPT was trained on something like 200 billion parameters, and at least version 3 was. And the later versions are what they call a collection of experts. They're all about 200 billion, but they kind of divide it out. Sorry, that was random information. Thank you again, ADHD. But yeah, so on a personal basis, if you're paying for API calls through ChatGPT, $20, unless you are really using this thing heavy, $20 is going to last you far more than a month, as opposed to the $20 subscription to OpenAI. At the enterprise level, yeah, it's just going to be cost is balancing the performance of the model against the task that you want it to do. There's that balance between, well, if I do a terrible model, I'm going to get bad customer service reviews. If I do a fantastic model, I'm going to be paying out the wazoo because this chatbot is getting however many API calls a second. At the code refactoring level, if you break $100 in a year, I would be shocked, unless you've got some horrendously large code base that you're doing several layers of refactoring on, which you might, right? I was doing one-shot programming, but if you were one-shot refactoring, but if you're doing multi-stage, where, especially when you get into what are called agentic workflows, where you have a complex model deciding what steps to take next, and then passing that off, choosing a smaller model to handle that smaller task, then you get agents talking back and forth to each other, which I apologize that I didn't go into depth on, and that will obviously rip up your API calls faster, because you're not waiting on a human to be in the loop. It's just models talking back and forth to each other, and if they get locked into a conversation together, they might get chatty on you. Just to be aware. I was going to do that one. Has anybody used mermaid diagrams in Markdown? Mermaid or plant UML diagrams?
I've used both.
All right. So I was really frustrated because I couldn't get ChatGPT to draw diagrams for me. Like it was like doing like ASCII art or something like that. But then I realized, ChatGPT knows how to do text-based markup languages. I tried doing an architecture diagram in Plant UML, and I told GPT, "Hey, can you actually do this for me?" And oh my goodness, if you've learned nothing else from the talk tonight, take that away, and it will change your diagramming game forevermore.
Thanks. I saw Steve's hand come up. Steve, do you have anything specific?
No, I was raising my hand to say I've used Plant UML.
There we go.
But I do have a question. And maybe you covered this because I was off in another window looking at some stuff. But how do you do the large refactorings?
Okay, so your large refactorings are going to be a matter of setting up those small tasks of what you want to do, and then setting these things up in batches to talk to an agent. So you create your agent that's going to do your small refactoring, and then you run it in a batch, and you fire your individual files or your classes, or at the function level, however you want to break this up, and you take that, you send it off to your small refactoring agent, and then it returns back, oh, here's what it would look like afterward. And especially when you get into, let's see, they have batches now, and they have batches in Azure as well. You can get a deal on doing these things as a batch, because they're able to do it when the traffic spikes are low. So they'll give you a bargain on it, and so then you're able to. So then you're able to do incremental stepwise refactoring. So just like I talked about with that T-SQL refactoring of, okay, take this step, now take that step, now take that step. You're just doing a pipeline at that point, and it's just a pipeline of steps. Only each step has its own its own custom instruction set for the language model. So you're creating an agent. I don't like their terminology, agents, but you're creating an agent for each individual step of the refactoring. So if you've got somebody, an agent who is the refactoring guru of security, you can wash the code through this and say, okay, hey, step 1, classify. Does this need to be refactored for SQL injection or what have you? And then the result of its classification is, oh yes, here this has SQL injection vulnerabilities, and then that comes back to your orchestrator agent. Your orchestrator agent says, oh, okay, well, okay, this agent says this code has SQL vulnerabilities. All right, well, I'm going to send it over to security refactoring agent over here. Security refactoring agent, please refactor this method for SQL injection, and it returns back just the code. And again, you've got to refine all of these queries with some examples to make sure that it just returns the code and doesn't get chatty with you. And so as you build up those small refactors, you can have a series of agents chew through your code base in batches to start improving your start improving your code base. Or if you want to know what improvements should be made, just go through and have your language model evaluate small bits for code smells, and you'll start getting a lot more interesting feedback than you do from your typical code smells that are just looking at the programmatic level.
Okay, one question. Have you heard of anything that has the ability to like point at a GitHub repo and
Yes.
use those files? Yes.
Yes, they exist. I can't think of any other. I don't know the name off the top of my head, but there are dozens of projects that I've seen that say, yeah, we're a plugin to Visual Studio. Give us access to your GitHub or your enterprise GitHub, and it loads the entire thing into context. Remember that research augmented generation I talked about? It goes through and populates a vector database with your entire code base, and you can start asking questions and reasoning against that. And that would actually be a very good follow-up conversation in a couple of months.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you, Tyler.